By the time the church bell tried to ring that morning, the sky above Ash Creek no longer belonged to Earth. It began with a shadow so wide it swallowed Main Street in one slow breath. 1 second the town was glowing gold in the weak light of dawn, every truck hood silver with frost, every storefront window catching the pale pink edge of sunrise, and the next it was as if somebody had lowered a dark hand over the whole valley. Ethan Carter looked up from the gas station pump across from Miller's Hardware and felt the coffee in his stomach go cold. The thing hanging above town was silent at first, impossibly silent, the kind of silence that made every small sound beneath it feel too loud. A dog barked twice and then stopped. A screen door slapped shut somewhere down Maple Avenue. The American flag outside the post office kept flapping in the wind like nothing in the world had changed, which somehow made it worse. Then the ship moved, not fast, not threatening, just enough to remind every man, woman, and kid standing in the street that it was real. It was enormous, easily longer than the football field behind Ash Creek High, its underside smooth and dark as river stone after rain, broken by lines of blue-white light that pulsed softly like a sleeping heartbeat. People came pouring out of houses in slippers and robes, still clutching mugs, still pulling jackets over their shoulders. Sheriff Donnelly stepped out from beside his cruiser with one hand on his belt and the other shielding his eyes. Old Mrs. Weller, who'd lived in town longer than anybody could remember, stood on the sidewalk in a quilted coat and whispered a prayer under her breath. Somewhere behind Ethan, a teenage boy said, "No way," like the words might make it smaller. But it only seemed to grow, filling the sky above the water tower, above the grain silos, above the weathered white church with its narrow steeple and faded red doors. A low hum rolled down from it a moment later, not loud enough to rattle windows, just deep enough to vibrate in Ethan's ribs. It felt less like sound and more like pressure, like the air itself had become aware. Then 3 smaller lights detached from the ship's belly and drifted downward through the cold morning haze, controlled and deliberate, until they hovered above the center of town square. People backed up. A few raised their phones. Ethan didn't. He just stood there in his work boots and canvas jacket, staring at the impossible thing over Ash Creek and feeling the same thought repeat in his mind with the steady certainty of a hammer strike: this was because of her. He didn't know how he knew. Maybe it was the shape of the lights, the faint blue glow, the memory of a trembling hand clutching a broken piece of star metal in the rain. Maybe it was the way the ship wasn't scanning the town like it meant harm. It was searching. Looking. Waiting. And Ethan knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes once the world has already changed, that whatever happened next had started the night before, in the cold behind the old substation, when he heard someone crying where no one should have been. 14 hours earlier, the rain had come down hard enough to turn the gravel lot behind Station 12 into black soup, and Ethan was standing ankle-deep in runoff with a wrench in one hand and the taste of ozone in the back of his throat when he heard it, one small, broken sound that did not belong to the storm. The sound came again, thin and uneven beneath the hiss of rain on metal, and Ethan Carter slowly straightened from the open transformer cabinet with his wrench still in one hand. Station 12 sat at the very edge of Ash Creek where the pavement gave up and the service road turned to mud, a forgotten utility yard boxed in by chain-link fence, leaning cedar trees, and stacks of weather-stained conduit nobody had touched in years. At 1:30 in the morning, with the storm pushing in from the hills and the nearest porch light nearly half a mile away, there should not have been anybody there except him. Ethan killed the beam on his headlamp for a second and listened. The substation answered in its usual language, water ticking off steel, power lines humming overhead, a loose panel rattling whenever the wind shifted. Then, under all of it, he heard that same unsteady breath and a quiet, muffled sob that sounded too young, too lost, too human for a place like this and yet somehow not human at all. He set the wrench down on the service cart and pulled off one soaked glove with his teeth. His fingers were numb from cold and copper dust. He reached for the radio clipped to his jacket, thumb hovering over the call button, then stopped. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the simple fact that Ethan had spent most of his life watching people turn every problem into somebody else's responsibility. He had seen it in small ways growing up in Ash Creek after his father left and his mother worked double shifts at the diner, seen it when neighbors pretended not to notice when old Mr. Harlan could not get his groceries up the steps, seen it during winter outages when people complained for hours before asking whether the lineman had eaten. Ethan was not a heroic man, and he would have been the first to say so. He paid his bills, kept his truck running with more hope than money, showed up on time, and fixed what was broken because somebody had to. That was how he moved through the world. Quietly. Reliably. The kind of man people forgot to thank because they assumed he would do the right thing anyway. Another cry slipped through the dark, and this time it cracked at the end like it had run out of strength halfway through. Ethan exhaled, clipped the radio back to his jacket, and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the dash of his service truck. The beam cut across wet gravel, old insulators, puddles that reflected the yellow security lights in broken little moons. He followed the sound past a leaning spool of cable and around the rear wall of the control shed where the rain hit less hard. His boots sank in the mud with each step. Somewhere above him a line popped softly, blue light flickering down the pole for half a second before vanishing. The storm smelled like wet pine, rust, and burned air. Ethan rounded the corner and the flashlight beam landed on the space between two rusted storage crates. He stopped dead. Curled into the narrow gap, arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold the cold back by force alone, was a girl with skin the color of sea glass under moonlight, hair dark with rain, bare feet in the mud, and eyes that caught the light like polished amber. In one shaking hand she clutched a fractured piece of metal that glowed faint blue from within, as if a star had been cracked open and left to die in her palm. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Rain tapped on the metal crates, streamed down the concrete wall, and hissed through the weeds along the fence, but inside that narrow pocket of light and shadow the whole storm seemed to hold its breath. Ethan lowered the flashlight a little, enough that it would not hit her straight in the eyes, and what he saw made the back of his neck tighten with a kind of awe he did not have a name for. She looked young, maybe late teens by human standards, though there was something in her face that made age feel like the wrong measurement. Her skin was not just blue. Up close it carried layers to it, turquoise over silver, as if light lived beneath the surface and shifted when she breathed. Rainwater ran down her temple and along the sharp curve of her jaw. Her clothes were simple but strange, a close-fitting dark fabric with fine seams that caught the beam in faint geometric lines, the sort of material that looked too precise to have been stitched by hand and too elegant to belong in the mud behind an electrical station in rural Oregon. One sleeve was torn near the wrist, exposing a slender forearm marked with pale, luminous patterns that flickered once and then faded. She flinched when Ethan took half a step forward. Not angry. Not threatening. Just frightened in a way that reached all the way down to instinct. Her hand tightened around the broken device until the blue glow brightened in the rain. Ethan could hear her breathing now, shallow and uneven, and see the way her shoulders trembled from cold or exhaustion or both. He had spent enough years on night calls to recognize the universal signs of somebody running on whatever came after panic. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, the same tone he used with skittish dogs after storms and with old men too proud to admit they needed help off icy sidewalks. "It is all right. I am not going to hurt you." The girl stared at him, unblinking. Her eyes were the most startling part of her, large and bright and gold at the center, with fine darker rings that shifted as the flashlight moved. They did not look empty or blank the way people in town always imagined alien eyes would. They looked full. Full of calculation, fear, confusion, and something that landed hardest on Ethan because he knew it too well, the raw, exhausted hope of somebody who had run out of places to go and was gambling everything on the stranger in front of them. She swallowed and tried to speak. The first sound that came out was warped by static, as if another voice were layered under hers and breaking apart on the way to air. She looked down at the cracked piece of glowing metal in her hand, tapped it weakly with 2 fingers, and tried again. "Home," she whispered at last, the word clipped and trembling but clear enough to stop Ethan cold. Then, after a beat, she added, "Please." The blue light inside the device fluttered once more and dimmed. Somewhere beyond the fence, tires whispered along the wet county road. Headlights swept past the far trees, gone in a second, but the girl recoiled so hard her shoulders hit the crate behind her. Ethan saw it then, not just fear, but the expectation of being taken, reported, turned in. Her gaze snapped from the road back to his face, searching him for the answer to some question bigger than language. Ethan slowly crouched down until he was closer to her eye level, set the flashlight on the ground so the beam pointed away, and took off his canvas work jacket despite the cold biting through his flannel the instant he did. He held it out carefully, giving her room to refuse. "Okay," he said, hearing the rain, the hum of the power lines, the hard thud of his own heart. "Let us start with getting you warm." She did not take the jacket right away. Her gaze moved from the worn canvas in Ethan's hand to his face and back again, as if kindness itself were a thing she had learned to measure for traps. Up close he could see the rain trembling on her lashes, the fine shiver running through her shoulders, the way her bare feet curled slightly against the cold mud between the crates. Ethan stayed where he was, one knee pressing into wet gravel, his flannel shirt already beginning to cling to his skin. Without the jacket over it. He knew better than to crowd frightened people. You gave them space, a steady voice, and one simple choice at a time. That had been his mother's rule when he was a kid and some neighbor boy came to the back porch bleeding pride and silence after a bad day at home. Finally the girl lifted one shaking hand, not the one holding the glowing device but the other, and touched the edge of the jacket with careful fingertips. The fabric seemed to surprise her. She looked at it, then at him again, and very slowly pulled it around herself. The canvas swallowed her slight frame. Ethan saw a little of the tension leave her jaw. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the first inch of it. "There you go," he said softly. "That is better than freezing." She blinked at him as though she understood the warmth in the sentence even if the words arrived only halfway. Then the radio on Ethan's chest crackled to life hard enough to make them both jump. Unit 7, report of unusual lights near County Route 12. Possible trespassers in the utility corridor. Advise if you have visual. Sheriff Donnelly's voice came through beneath a wash of static, tinny and sharp in the rain. The girl recoiled at once, pressing herself farther into the corner, one hand gripping the jacket closed while the other clutched the blue device so tightly her knuckles flashed pale silver. Ethan looked down at the radio. For a heartbeat he could feel the whole town sitting on the other side of that speaker, its rules, its suspicion, the easy path laid out in front of him. All he had to do was press the button and say yes. He found something. He could step back into the neat order of his life by morning. Instead he thumbed the volume down until Donnelly's voice became little more than a faint mechanical murmur and unclipped the radio from his jacket. "Maintenance at Station 12, he said after a moment, keeping his tone flat and ordinary. "Just storm interference. No visual on anything out here." The silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Then dispatch answered with a bored copy that meant they believed him, at least for now. Ethan slid the radio onto the ground beside the flashlight and looked back. At the girl. Her eyes were fixed on him with open disbelief, as if the decision he had just made belonged to a species she had never studied. Rainwater dripped off the end of his hair and onto his cheek. "You do not need to be scared of that," he said, nodding toward the radio. "Not tonight." She swallowed, glanced toward the road again, and then lifted the cracked blue device between both hands like an offering or a plea. Symbols shimmered across its surface, faint lines of light folding and unfolding in patterns Ethan did not understand. The thing was damaged, that much was obvious even to him. One corner had split open, exposing a nest of glowing threads finer than wire. The girl tapped the surface, wincing when the light stuttered, and forced out the only word that seemed to survive the broken translator every time. "Home." Then she touched her chest with 2 fingers. "Leora." Ethan nodded once. "Leora," he repeated carefully. He put a hand against his own chest. "Ethan." Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time something that was not fear passed across her face. Recognition, maybe. The smallest beginning of a bridge. Ethan rose slowly and extended his hand, palm up, not to pull her but to offer direction. "Come on, Leora," he said. "My truck has heat, and whatever that thing is, we can figure it out somewhere drier than this." Leora stared at Ethan's outstretched hand as if it were the strangest thing she had seen all night, stranger even than the rain, the wire fences, or the humming lines above them. Then, with the kind of care people used around cracked glass, she placed her fingers in his. Her skin was cold enough to make him tense on instinct, not icy, not unnatural, just far too cold for someone standing barefoot in a storm. He did not pull her up so much as steady her while she rose. She was taller than he expected once she stood, though the jacket swallowed her shape and made her look smaller somehow, like a person still halfway hidden inside fear. For a moment she swayed, the blue device dimming in her grasp, and Ethan moved closer without crowding her, one hand hovering near her elbow in case she lost balance. "Easy," he said. "The truck is right there." They crossed the muddy yard slowly. Gravel shifted under their feet, water splashed around his boots, and every few seconds Leora's head turned sharply toward some sound Ethan barely noticed, a branch scraping chain link, a loose sign knocking in the wind, the distant growl of a pickup on the county road. Whatever had brought her here had trained her nerves hard. By the time they reached the service truck, Ethan was soaked through to the shoulders and shivering in earnest, but the sight of Leora glancing up at the cab like it might be a shelter instead of a machine made the discomfort feel small. He opened the passenger door and stepped back. "You can sit there," he said. "Heat comes on fast if the old girl is in a good mood." Leora looked at the seat, then at him, then carefully climbed in, moving like she expected something to object. The dome light came on overhead, pale yellow and ordinary, and for the first time Ethan got a clear look at her without rain streaking across the view. Mud speckled her ankles and the hem of her strange dark clothing. A faint bruise-colored shadow lay beneath her eyes, not from injury, he thought, but from exhaustion. She held the blue device close to her chest until he rounded the hood and slid behind the wheel. The cab smelled like wet canvas, engine oil, stale coffee, and pine cleaner from the rag he kept under the seat. Human smells. Safe smells, he hoped. He turned the key. The truck coughed once, twice, then caught with a rough familiar rumble that made the steering column shake. A second later warm air began pushing through the vents. Leora jerked at the sound, then slowly turned her face toward the heat. Ethan watched some of the tension melt out of her jaw. Not all of it, but enough to matter. He reached behind his seat, grabbed a bottle of water and a clean shop towel, and set both carefully on the center console where she could take them without feeling managed. "Water," he said, lifting the bottle a little before placing it back down. Then he tapped the towel. "Dry." Leora followed the motions, then nodded once, almost formal. "Water," she repeated softly, the translator in her broken device smoothing the word into something clearer than before. She unscrewed the cap with a trembling hand and drank. Too fast, then stopped herself and took slower sips, as if remembering a rule from far away. Ethan looked forward through the rain-blurred windshield, giving her the courtesy of not watching too closely. Outside, the station lights buzzed in their cages and reflected off the hood in long yellow streaks. Inside, the heater pushed warmth into the small cab inch by inch. After a minute Leora laid the towel over her lap, lifted the fractured blue device between them, and touched two glowing points on its surface. A faint projection flickered into the air above her palm, unstable but readable enough to make Ethan narrow his eyes. It was a map, or something close to one, a wireframe of roads, elevation lines, and one pulsing marker far north of town where no houses stood at all. Leora looked from the hovering image to Ethan and whispered the same word again, but this time it sounded less like a plea and more like a destination. Home. Ethan leaned closer, one hand still resting on the wheel, and studied the trembling map above Leora's palm. The projection wavered with every bump of the idling truck, lines of pale blue light sketching out county roads, tree cover, elevation, and one blinking point somewhere beyond the north ridge where Ash Creek gave way to old timberland and abandoned service routes. He knew those roads. Everybody who grew up in town knew them. There were no houses out there, not anymore. Just logging tracks, a collapsed fire watch station, and an old observation site the county stopped maintaining years ago after lightning took out half the equipment. Ethan frowned, then glanced at Leora. "That is where you need to go?" he asked, pointing carefully at the marker. Leora followed his finger and nodded at once, a little too quickly, like she was afraid the answer might disappear if she hesitated. "Home," she said again, and this time the translator caught the word with less static than before. Ethan looked back at the map. He tried to make sense of it the simple way first, the human way. Maybe somebody was hiding her out there. Maybe there was a cabin off-grid, some trailer tucked behind the trees, some explanation that would let this night become a story he barely believed by morning instead of a dividing line in his life. It would not have been the strangest thing he had seen in Ash Creek. People came out to the woods to disappear from bills, from divorces, from grief, from the version of themselves everybody in town thought they knew. Maybe aliens did something similar. He almost smiled at the thought, but the look on Leora's face stopped him. She was not embarrassed, not secretive, not hopeful in the way people looked when you were taking them somewhere familiar. She was intent. Every bit of her attention was fixed on that blinking point like it was more than an address. Like it was time running out. Ethan shifted into drive. "All right," he said. "We will go see what is out there." Relief moved across her features so quickly and so quietly that it barely qualified as an expression. Her shoulders loosened. Her fingers, still wrapped around the damaged device, eased by a fraction. It hit Ethan harder than he expected, that small release. He had not done anything remarkable. He had offered a jacket, a seat in a truck, a road to wherever she was trying to reach. But to Leora it seemed to matter in ways he could not yet measure. The tires rolled out of the utility yard with a crunch of wet gravel. Rain streaked across the windshield in silver sheets until the wipers pushed it aside in steady arcs. On either side of the county road, the dark pines stood packed close together, their trunks black with water, their tops disappearing into mist. Ash Creek at night always felt older in the rain, less like a town and more like a thin patch of civilization borrowed from the woods. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel, heater humming, dashboard lights painting the cab in muted green. Beside him, Leora sat angled toward the vent, soaking in warmth like somebody who had not trusted she would feel it again. After a few miles he reached to the back seat, found the paper bag he had forgotten from his last stop in town, and pulled out a wrapped turkey sandwich and a bag of pretzels. He set them on the console between them. "It is not much," he said. "But it is food." Leora studied the sandwich with cautious fascination, then looked at him as if trying to decide whether this, too, came with a hidden price. Ethan unwrapped half of it. Took a bite first, chewed, swallowed, and nodded toward the rest. "See? Not poison. Just small-town gourmet." For the first time since he found her, a flicker of something almost humanly familiar touched her mouth. It was not quite a smile, more the memory of one, but it changed her face enough that Ethan felt the cab grow warmer for reasons that had nothing to do with the heater. She took the sandwich carefully, tasted it, and closed her eyes for half a second as if the simple fact of warm bread and salt had reached some exhausted part of her words could not. Outside, the road curved north into deeper dark, and the pulsing marker on the map kept blinking like a heartbeat neither of them could ignore. The farther they drove from town, the more the world narrowed to the rhythm of wipers, the wash of headlights over wet pavement, and the soft electronic pulse of the damaged map hovering above Leora's hand whenever the truck hit a smooth stretch of road. Ethan kept one eye on the county route and the other on the fuel gauge, which had been dropping faster than he liked ever since cold weather settled into the valley. A few miles ahead, the old Sinclair station at the fork still kept its diner open all night for truckers, linemen, and the sort of people who could not afford to wait for morning. Ethan eased into the lot under the glow of a flickering green sign, killed the engine, and listened as the sudden quiet folded around them. Rain tapped on the roof in a softer pattern now. Through the diner windows he could see a waitress refilling coffee, two men in reflective jackets hunched over plates of hash browns, and a teenage kid wiping down the counter with the bored precision of somebody counting minutes until sunrise. Leora looked at the building with open uncertainty. "It is all right," Ethan said. "You stay here. I will be 2 minutes." Her hand closed around his sleeve before he could reach for the door. The gesture was so quick, so instinctive, that it caught them both off guard. Her fingers loosened at once, but her eyes held his with a clear enough message that translation was not needed. "Do not leave me alone." Ethan glanced at the diner, then back at her, and gave a small nod. "Okay," he said. "No diner." He reached behind the seat instead and came up with the emergency blanket he kept for winter calls, still sealed in crinkling plastic. He tore it open, spread the silver material over her knees and the borrowed jacket, and watched her look down at it with the same careful curiosity she had shown the sandwich. "Cheap, ugly, and works every time," he said. While the fuel pump clicked on outside, Ethan found an old thermos in the cup holder and unscrewed the lid. There was still some coffee left, barely warm. He hesitated, then laughed quietly at himself and set it aside. "Never mind. That could strip paint." Leora tilted her head, not understanding the words but catching the tone. Ethan opened the glove box, dug around beneath registration papers and spare fuses, and came up with a pack of peanut butter crackers and a small flashlight no bigger than his palm. He offered the crackers first. Leora accepted one, then another, and this time when she ate there was less caution in it. More trust. More hunger. Ethan leaned back against the seat and let the moment settle. The cab held the kind of warmth that only existed in old vehicles and kitchens after midnight, made of bad insulation, tired heaters, and the simple comfort of shared silence. After a while Leora touched 2 fingers to her chest again. "Leora," she said more clearly than before. Then she pointed to him. "Ethan." He smiled without meaning to. "Yeah," he said. "That is me." She looked pleased by getting it right. Then, with great care, she tapped the blue device and shifted the map aside. For a second the projection scrambled into static. Then a new image formed, shaky but bright enough to make Ethan stop breathing. It was not a road map. It was the sky, charted in clean luminous lines, with one route marked from high above the Pacific Northwest down to a blinking point north of Ash Creek. Leora touched that point, then looked at him and whispered, not with fear this time but with aching certainty, "Not house. Home." Ethan looked at the hovering star map until the edges of it began to blur with the rain on the windshield beyond. He had spent his whole life measuring distance in county miles, power grids, fence lines, and mountain roads. You drove 10 minutes east to the feed store, 20 south to the river, 40 north if you wanted to reach the logging cut before sunrise. Home, in his world, had always been an address or a porch light or the sound of your own front door closing behind you at the end of a shift. But the glowing lines suspended above Leora's hand were charting something else entirely. They were not roads through Ash Creek. They were routes through darkness so large his mind could only brush against it and pull back. Leora touched one bright mark hanging far above the others, then dragged her finger down the projected path until it ended at the blinking point north of town. Her voice was soft, but the translator held steady this time. "Signal Place," she said, searching for the words as if pulling them through deep water. "Call home." Ethan let out a slow breath and rested his hands on the steering wheel. "So you are not trying to get back to a house," he said quietly. "You are trying to reach something that can find you." Leora nodded at once. Relief and urgency flashed across her face together. She tapped the damaged device near the cracked corner, and a harsh flicker of static rippled through the map before it settled again. "Broken," she whispered. Then she pointed north. "Need, send." The fuel pump outside clicked off with a hollow metal knock. Ethan sat there for another second, staring at the diner windows, the sleepy little gas station island, the coffee sign buzzing in the rain, all of it so ordinary it looked unreal now. If he stepped out, went inside, and called the sheriff, maybe life would slide back into something recognizable. There would be questions, headlines, government people, and a version of this story that belonged to everybody except the frightened girl sitting under his old work jacket. That path was easy. It was also wrong. Ethan had known that since the moment he heard her crying behind the substation. He started the truck again. The engine rumbled awake, and the heater pushed another wave of warmth through the cab. "All right," he said, pulling back onto the road. "Then we get you to your signal place." Leora turned toward him slowly, as if she still could not quite believe he had chosen that answer. "Why?" she asked. It was the clearest single word she had spoken yet. Ethan smiled faintly at the windshield. Outside, the county road narrowed as it climbed, wet pine branches crowding closer to the shoulders, their shadows flashing in and out of the headlights. "Because you asked for help," he said. "And because you were crying in the rain behind a utility station at 1:30 in the morning. That usually means something has gone pretty wrong." Leora watched him in silence, her gold eyes bright in the dashboard glow. "No trade?" she asked after a moment. The question landed in the cab with surprising weight. Ethan glanced at her. "Trade?" She touched her chest, then gestured weakly between them, trying to build meaning with hands when language still failed her. "Help for give. Help for take. Always." Ethan understood then, not the full history behind those words, but enough to feel it. In her world, kindness came with a receipt. In his, sometimes it did too, if he was being honest. But not always. Not tonight. He shook his head. "No trade, Leora." The truck climbed higher into the hills. Mist thickened between the trees, and the cracked blue device cast shifting starlight across the cab ceiling, turning the old pickup into something caught between Ash Creek and a sky neither of them had finished crossing yet. Leora looked down at the map in her hands, then back at Ethan, and for the first time since he found her, the fear in her expression loosened enough to make room for wonder. The road turned from cracked pavement to old Forest Service gravel about 5 miles past the last marked county sign, and the truck began to shudder in a familiar, bone-deep way Ethan felt more than heard. He eased off the gas and guided the headlights between towering pines slick with rain, their trunks flashing by like dark pillars in the mist. Somewhere below the ridge, water rushed through a swollen creek bed, hidden but loud, and every now and then the tires slipped just enough on the wet stones to remind him how far they were from help if the old truck decided it had done enough for one night. Leora seemed to feel the change too. She sat straighter, both hands wrapped around the damaged device in her lap, watching the star map pulse brighter as they climbed. The blinking marker had stopped drifting and now held steady somewhere ahead, beyond the next rise. Ethan kept his eyes on the narrow road. "We are close?" he asked. Leora nodded, but the movement carried no relief this time. Her face had gone still again, not closed exactly, just inward, as if every mile north pulled her deeper into memory. After a while she lifted one hand from the device and touched the fogged passenger window, tracing a shape in the condensation before it faded. It took Ethan a second to understand what she had drawn. A circle. Then a smaller circle beside it. Then one line descending away from both. "Family?" he asked gently. Her throat moved before she answered. "Mother. Brother." The translator caught the words cleanly, then crackled on whatever came next. Leora shut her eyes, breathed in, and tried again. Ship fell. Fire in sky. Noise. Her fingers curled against the window. "I lost." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had guessed pieces of it already, but hearing it from her, halting and stripped down to the most necessary words, made it land differently. He pictured it without wanting to, bright metal splitting cloud, a strange girl thrown into rain and trees and a town that would not understand her if she stood in the middle of Main Street and begged. You got separated, he said quietly, offering shape to the thought. Leora nodded. I called, she whispered. No answer. She looked down at the broken device. Again. 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 The last word came out with painful clarity, and Ethan suddenly understood the exhaustion in her eyes, the way panic had already burned itself into something duller and deeper by the time he found her. She had not been crying because she was weak. She had been crying because hope was a machine she had kept forcing to run long past the point it should have failed. The truck rounded a bend, and through the trees Ethan caught the silhouette of the old observation tower on the ridge ahead, black against a lighter patch of cloud. Lightning had taken part of the upper dish years ago, but the county never fully removed it. The locals called it dead. Ethan had not thought about it in months. Beside him, Leora saw it too. Her breath caught. There, she said, almost too softly to hear. Ethan nodded, but neither of them spoke for another minute. The heater hummed. Gravel popped under the tires. Rain softened to a fine mist that silvered the windshield. Finally Leora turned toward him, and in the muted dashboard glow her eyes looked older than before, not in years but in grief. I cried, she said carefully, searching for each word like it mattered. Not for me. She touched her chest once, then pointed upward through the roof, toward the sky hidden beyond the storm. For them. Because maybe they think I am gone. Ethan swallowed hard and kept driving toward the ruined tower on the ridge, because there are some kinds of heartbreak too large for speech, and the only honest thing a person can do in the face of them is keep going. The observation tower stood on the ridge like the skeleton of an idea the county had forgotten to bury, its steel frame wet with rain, its collapsed satellite dish tilted toward the clouds at a broken angle. Ethan parked near the chain-link gate, killed the engine, and for a second all he could hear was the ticking of hot metal cooling under the hood and the distant hiss of wind moving through the pines. Leora was already staring upward, her whole body drawn toward the tower with a taut, almost painful focus. The blue device in her hands pulsed faster now, matching the blinking marker above the ridge until it seemed less like a tool and more like a heart finding its rhythm again. This is it? Ethan asked. Leora nodded. Old signal, she said. Can wake. Ethan looked up at the rusted stairs winding around the structure, the dead cable lines hanging along one side, the padlocked service box at the base where county hardware had once fed power to the dish. Maybe, he thought, if the main relay was not completely fried and if the storm had not grounded the whole system beyond saving, he could jury-rig enough current to push a transmission through. It was exactly the sort of unreasonable problem people in Ash Creek always dropped on him with a shrug and a hopeful smile. He got out of the truck, grabbed his toolbox from behind the seat, and circled to the passenger side just as his phone lit up in his pocket. 3 missed calls. 1 from a utility office. 2 from Sheriff Donnelly. Ethan stared at the screen while rain gathered on the edge of the phone case and slid across his knuckles. A second later another call came through, and with it a text from his coworker Ben that read, "Saw your truck on County Cam headed north. Town is buzzing. People saying strange lights, maybe that thing from dispatch. Donnelly asking questions." Ethan exhaled slowly and slipped the phone back into his pocket without answering. Leora had stepped out onto the gravel and drawn the jacket tighter around herself, her eyes moving from his face to the dark tree line below the ridge. "Problem?" she asked. Her translator still stumbled, but the word came clear enough. Ethan glanced down the slope where the narrow access road disappeared into mist and wet pine. Far off, through the trees, 2 beams of headlights flickered and vanished as another vehicle rounded the lower bend. Then another set appeared behind it. Not fast. Not chasing. Just coming. But at 2 in the morning nobody drove up an abandoned service road for no reason. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "Looks like company." Leora's fingers tightened around the device until the blue glow brightened against her palms. Fear returned to her face so quickly it hurt to watch. Not the blind panic from behind the substation. This was worse. This was the look of somebody who had almost made it and knew exactly how much could still be taken away. Ethan set the toolbox down on the wet gravel and lifted both hands a little, grounding the moment with the same calm he had used all night. "Listen to me," he said. "I am going to get that tower working if there is any life left in it. You stay close, and you let me handle whoever comes up that road." Leora searched his face as if trying to tell whether courage and foolishness were always this hard to separate in humans. The headlights below grew brighter through the trees. Rain whispered over metal. Somewhere high above them the broken dish gave a low groan in the wind. Then Leora gave one small nod, and Ethan Carter turned toward a dead tower, a live storm, and a road that was bringing Ash Creek straight to them. Ethan snapped open the rusted service box with the flat end of a screwdriver and felt cold rain run straight down the back of his neck as the metal door groaned outward. Inside, the old relay assembly looked exactly the way county equipment always looked after years of neglect: corroded terminals, cracked insulation, a breaker panel yellowed with age, and one main control bus coated in a film of dust and moisture that should have killed it years ago. "Still got bones," he muttered, setting his toolbox on the concrete pad and sweeping the beam of his work light across the wiring. Above him the broken dish shifted in the wind with a low metallic complaint. Behind him, gravel crunched as the first set of headlights reached the lower turn in the access road. Leora stood near the truck, the oversized canvas jacket wrapped around her slight frame, the blue device glowing between her hands like a captured piece of dawn. Ethan glanced back at her. "Can your device connect if I get power into the tower?" Leora stepped closer, rain silvering her dark hair against the jacket collar, and touched the cracked surface with 2 fingers. A cluster of symbols bloomed into the air, brighter than before, then aligned with the tower in a rotating column of pale light. "Yes," she said. "Need wake signal. Then send." Ethan nodded once. That was enough. He pulled on insulated gloves, found the least ruined cable feed, and started tracing the line by feel and flashlight, his mind settling into the old familiar rhythm of work. Electricity did not care about fear or politics or what species was standing beside you. It cared about contact, flow, resistance, timing. Human problems got messy because people lied. Circuits, at least, were honest. A car door slammed down the ridge. Then another. Voices rose through the rain, indistinct at first, then clearer as they climbed. "Sheriff Donnelly. Ben from the utility office." Somebody from town Ethan recognized only by the nasal edge of his outrage. They were not shouting yet, but urgency was already in the air, and urgency had a way of making ordinary people feel entitled to the worst version of themselves. Ethan found a snapped terminal, stripped back the brittle sheath with his knife, and bridged it with a spare copper lead from his kit. The relay flickered once, failed, then held with a weak amber glow. "Come on," he breathed. Leora had moved to the tower base now, watching the ancient equipment like a person listening for a heartbeat through a locked door. "Ethan," she said softly. He looked up. "If they stop this, no call. No home." He saw then what she was really asking him, not with words but with that terrified steadiness in her face. Choose. Choose clearly. Choose now. Headlights washed the ridge in pale gold as the first truck rolled through the open gate. Ethan wiped rain from his brow with the back of his wrist and looked from the arriving vehicles to the half-dead relay in his hands. He knew what would happen if he stepped away. Questions. Delay. Procedures. Maybe some official in a warm office deciding that a frightened girl under an old work jacket could wait until morning for mercy. He had seen enough of the world to know morning did not always improve people. So Ethan Carter made the quiet kind of decision that never looked heroic while it was happening. He took the portable power pack from his truck, clipped it directly into the control bus, ignored the warning light that flashed red on the casing, and fed the old tower more charge than it had any right to carry. The relay came alive with a rising hum. The dish above them shuddered, turned 2 degrees toward the clouded sky, and the blue device in Leora's hands flared so bright the rain around it looked like falling glass. By the time Sheriff Donnelly reached the concrete pad, Ethan was already soaked to the bone, kneeling in cold mud beside a living signal, and refusing to let go. For a moment nobody on the ridge moved. Sheriff Donnelly stopped 3 steps onto the concrete pad with rain darkening the shoulders of his uniform. Ben froze beside the open gate with his hood half up and his mouth half open, and the 2 other men from town stood under their truck lights staring at the tower as if it had risen from the dead just to embarrass them. The old dish above Ethan gave another shuddering turn, slow and stubborn, shedding beads of rain that flashed blue in the growing light from Leora's device. The signal column climbing from her hands into the storm had become almost solid now, a pale shaft of luminous geometry cutting through mist and cloud with the quiet certainty of something that knew exactly where it belonged. Ethan stayed. On one knee beside the relay box, gloved hands locked on the power leads, feeling the portable battery strain through the cable in a deep metallic hum that traveled up his wrists and into his shoulders. Donnelly's voice came first, lower than Ethan expected. "Carter," he said, not angry now, just stunned. "What in God's name are you doing?" Ethan looked up through wet hair and rain and gave the only answer he had. "Helping her call home." Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. Maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe it was because Ash Creek had all the usual flaws of a small town but still knew how to recognize plain truth when it stood in front of them soaked to the bone. Leora stepped forward then, the canvas jacket hanging nearly to her knees, her hair damp against her temples, her gold eyes bright with fear and hope so tightly braided together they had become something like dignity. She lifted the damaged device with both hands. The translator crackled once, then steadied with surprising clarity. "Please," she said, and her voice carried farther than it should have in the rain. "No, stop. Family searching." That did it. Ben looked away first, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck the way he always did when shame caught up to him. One of the other men muttered something about not knowing. Even Donnelly's shoulders eased, as though whatever story he had been prepared to tell himself on the drive up had fallen apart the instant he saw her standing there like somebody's child instead of somebody's threat. Then the storm changed. Not louder. Not harsher. Just different. The clouds above the ridge drew inward in a slow spiral, rain thinning to silver threads as the whole sky seemed to gather around the beam coming off the tower. The hum in the relay box deepened. Leora's device flared so bright Ethan had to squint. And over all of them, over Ash Creek, over the dark pines and the county roads and the little lives that had never expected to matter to anything beyond the next paycheck and the next snowfall, a shape emerged behind the clouds. Vast. Silent. Radiant at the edges where dawn struck metal not made by any factory on earth. Nobody on the ridge spoke. Down in town, church bells began to ring the hour. Faint and ordinary beneath the impossible thing lowering through the morning sky. Smaller lights detached from the ship and drifted toward the ridge in a controlled descent, not weapons, not fire, just 3 smooth craft glowing blue-white against the wet gray dawn. Leora's breath caught. She took one unsteady step forward, then another, and Ethan saw the exact moment hope stopped being something painful inside her and became real. When the first shuttle touched down in the clearing beyond the tower, its light washing over the gravel, the trucks, the sheriff, and the exhausted lineman kneeling in the mud, Ash Creek stood still long enough to learn what wonder felt like. The shuttle door opened without a sound, and a wash of soft blue light spilled across the wet clearing, turning the gravel to silver and the raindrops to drifting sparks. 2 tall figures stepped down first in fitted uniforms that seemed woven from shadow and starlight, their movements precise but unhurried, not soldiers arriving for a fight but people carrying the weight of something sacred. Between them came a woman with the same sea-glass skin as Leora, though deeper in tone, like twilight over deep water, and at her side a younger boy with dark hair plastered to his forehead by the mist and eyes so much like Leora's that Ethan felt the truth before a word was spoken. Leora made a sound Ethan had never heard from her before, not fear, not pain, but pure relief breaking open all at once. She ran. The jacket he had given her slipped from one shoulder as she crossed the clearing, and the woman met her halfway, gathering her into an embrace so fierce and desperate it erased every strange line of alien biology and left only one thing that mattered. Family. The boy reached them a second later and wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a long moment the entire ridge stood still around that reunion. Even Sheriff Donnelly removed his hat. Even Ben looked down at the mud like he had wandered into church by accident. When Leora finally stepped back, she turned at once and searched for Ethan. He was still kneeling by the relay box with cold water dripping from his sleeves and battery cables biting into his gloved hands. The tower hummed overhead, old metal answering a call it had never been built. To understand. One of the uniformed figures moved toward him, but the woman lifted a hand and stopped him. Then she approached Ethan herself. Up close, she carried the kind of presence some people spent their whole lives trying to imitate and never reached, the effortless gravity of someone used to command but not insulated from love. Her eyes dropped briefly to the makeshift wiring, the overloaded battery pack, the mud on Ethan's jeans, and something softened in her expression before she spoke. The translator in Leora's restored device rendered her voice smooth and low. You kept our daughter in the world long enough for us to find her. Ethan looked past her to Leora standing with one hand still clutching her brother's sleeve like she did not trust Joy to stay unless she held on to it. She found me, he said. I just gave her a ride. To his own surprise, that made Leora laugh softly through the tears shining on her cheeks. The woman studied him for another second, then placed one luminous hand over her heart and bowed her head, not deeply, just enough to make every person from Ash Creek watching understand they were seeing gratitude, not theater. In my world, she said, there are honors for bravery, for duty, and for sacrifice. But what you gave my daughter was rarer. You gave kindness when fear would have been easier. Ethan had no answer ready for that. He was a utility technician from a town with one stoplight and a hardware store that still sold nails by the pound. He was wet, tired, and pretty sure his truck needed a new alternator. So he said the only honest thing he had left. She needed help. The woman smiled then, small and sad and radiant all at once, as if that sentence had explained more about humanity than any report ever could. Leora stepped forward, removed the old canvas jacket from her shoulders, and held it out to Ethan with both hands. For a second he thought she was simply returning it. Then he saw what rested on top of the folded collar, a small crystal no larger than a thumb joint, glowing with the same quiet blue as her broken device once had, steady now, healed. Ethan took it carefully. It was warm. So you remember, Leora whispered. He looked at her, then at the family gathered behind her, then at the ship hanging vast and silent over the waking town below. I do not think I could forget, he said. Later, after the shuttles rose and the clouds closed gently behind them, after the sheriff finally found his voice and Ben stopped staring at the sky long enough to help disconnect the battery pack, after Ash Creek went back down the mountain carrying a story nobody would tell the same way twice, Ethan stood alone for a minute beside the dead tower and watched dawn spread through the wet pines.